already heard the tea kettle whistling before my eyes were fully open that Tuesday morning. That's the thing about being 73. Your body wakes you up whether you're ready or not. And mine had decided 5:47:47 a.m. was a perfectly reasonable hour to start the day. I shuffled into the kitchen in my robe and slippers, the old oak floors creaking under my feet the way they always had, and I stood at the window watching the backyard while the water finished heating. The rose bushes my late husband planted along the back fence were starting to bloom. Pink and stubborn, just like him. I was thinking about nothing in particular. That's the honest truth. I was thinking about whether I needed to call the exterminator again and whether the grocery store would have the good sourdough on Thursday. Regular, ordinary thoughts for a regular, ordinary Tuesday. I was not thinking that by Friday my daughter and son-in-law would try to take everything I had. My name is Iris. No, wait. Let me start over honestly. I've been telling this story wrong in my head for months, always starting from the wrong place. The real beginning isn't that Tuesday morning. The real beginning is a Sunday, about 6 weeks before that, when my daughter called to say she and her husband wanted to come for dinner, just the two of them, without my grandson. That detail mattered. I just didn't know it yet. My daughter's name is Faye. She's 51 years old and she has her father's dark eyes and my stubbornness, which is a combination that has made her formidable her whole life. I've always been proud of that about her. I've also always been a little afraid of it. When Faye decides something, that's usually the end of the discussion. She decided to marry her husband Walter when she was 29, and nobody thought it was a good idea, including me. And they've been married 22 years, and I've been proven wrong every single day. When she decided to leave her job in corporate accounting to open a small business, same thing. I thought she was out of her mind. The business turned 15 years old last spring, so when Faye decided something, I paid attention, even when I didn't understand it yet. Walter's a different kind of person entirely. Tall, soft-spoken, the kind of man who holds the door for strangers and remembers your coffee order, and never, not once in 22 years, has raised his voice at anyone in my presence. I liked him from the beginning. I still like him. That's what makes what happened so complicated, because I don't think Walter is a bad man. I think Walter is a weak one, which sometimes ends up being worse. They came to dinner that first Sunday in March, and I made pot roast because it was cold, and because it's what Faye asked for, the way she always had since she was small. We ate and talked about nothing, the way families do, the neighbors, the news, a show they'd been watching. It was pleasant. It was normal. I poured decaf after, and we sat at the dining room table, and that's when Faye folded her hands, in that way she has, very deliberate, and said she had something she wanted to talk to me about. She said she'd been thinking about my situation. I asked what situation she meant. She said, "Mom, you're 73. You're alone in this house. Anything could happen." I told her plenty could happen, but most of it probably wouldn't, and I'd been alone in this house since her father passed 4 years ago, and I was managing fine. She said she knew that. She said she wasn't questioning my capability. She was just thinking ahead, planning, being responsible. Wasn't that what I always taught her? I said yes. That was what I always taught her. She said she'd been doing some research and she thought we should think about formalizing some things. Getting her name added to my accounts just in case. Maybe a durable power of attorney so that if anything ever happened to me, she'd be able to handle my affairs without everything getting tied up in court. She made it sound so sensible. She had the vocabulary of it perfectly prepared. Durable power of attorney, fiduciary responsibility, probate, estate planning. It sounded like something she'd read about in a magazine and gotten very enthusiastic about. I told her I'd think about it. She nodded and smiled, and we had more decaf, and I drove home. Wait, no, I was already home. That's what I mean about old age. I poured a second cup, and I walked back to my bedroom, and I thought about the conversation for a long time before I slept. Something felt off. I couldn't name it that night. I thought maybe I was being paranoid, the way old women are accused of being paranoid when they notice things. But something in my stomach was pulling. The way it used to pull when Faye was a teenager and came home too cheerful after nights I was worried about. She was always too cheerful when she was hiding something. I let it go. A few weeks passed. She called, texted, stopped by twice with food, a lasagna, then a container of soup. She mentioned the power of attorney again, casually, both times. She said she'd found a notary who could come to the house if I didn't want to drive. Wasn't that convenient? I said I was still thinking. I was still thinking on the Thursday evening in April when my grandson showed up at my front door. His name is Owen. He's 8 years old and he has a gap between his two front teeth, and he's currently obsessed with anything related to trains. A fact I know because he tells me about trains at every available opportunity. He's Faye and Walter's only child. He is, without question, the best thing in my life right now. I don't say that to be dramatic. I say it because it's plain true, and there's no point in being coy about it at 73. Owen was standing on my front step in his jacket, backpack still on, looking like he'd come directly from somewhere in a hurry. His face was flushed. I said, "Sweetheart, what are you doing here?" "Where's your mom?" He said she was at home. He'd walk. He said it like it was nothing, but it's 4 blocks, and he'd clearly done it alone, and I felt my heart do that particular kind of lurch it does when a grandchild surprises you. I said, "Does your mum know you're here?" He shook his head. I brought him inside and gave him a glass of milk and some of the shortbread I'd made that weekend, and he sat at my kitchen counter and looked at me with those very serious eyes he has, the ones that are exactly like his grandfather's. And he said, "Grandma, I need to tell you something." I said, "Okay, tell me." He said, "Mom and Dad were talking last night after they thought I was asleep." He paused. He picked up a piece of shortbread. He put it back down. He said they were talking about your house. I said, "Oh, what about it?" He said, "I don't think it was nice." He was struggling the way kids struggle when they know something is wrong but don't have the adult words for the wrongness. He said, "Dad said something about signing and Mom said she needed you to do it before you changed your mind. And then Dad asked if you would, and Mom said she just needed to handle it the right way." He looked at me. He said, "Grandma, are they going to take your house?" The kitchen was very quiet. The refrigerator hummed. Out in the yard, a bird was doing something energetic in the rose bushes. I looked at my grandson, 8 years old, 4 blocks alone, still wearing his backpack, and I felt something settle in me that I didn't expect. Not panic, not anger, not really. Something quieter and colder than anger. The kind of clarity that comes when something you half suspected becomes something you know. I said, "Owen, you did exactly the right thing coming here." I fixed his face expression. He looked uncertain, like he was worried he'd gotten his parents in trouble and didn't know if that was allowed. I told him that sometimes love means telling hard things to people you love, and that he had done something very brave, and that I was okay. I asked him if he wanted to call his mom and tell her where he was. He said he guessed he should. I let him use my phone. Faye answered on the second ring, and I could hear her voice jump, that particular frequency of mum panic, before Owen explained where he was. I heard her exhale. She said she'd come get him. I said that would be fine, and I handed Owen another piece of shortbread. And when the call ended, I sat across from him, and we talked about trains until Faye's headlights came up the driveway 20 minutes later. She came to the door. She thanked me for calling. She told Owen to get in the car. She looked at me and said she'd call tomorrow, and I looked back at her and said, "Yes, you should." And something passed between us that was too complicated for either of us to say out loud right then. Owen waved at me from the back seat. I waved back. I stood in the doorway until the car turned a corner. Then I went inside and I sat at my kitchen table, and I started making a list. Here is what I knew. As of that Thursday night, my daughter wanted my power of attorney. She was in a hurry to get it. She had said, according to my 8-year-old grandson, that she needed me to do it before I changed my mind. That language, "before I changed my mind," was not the language of someone trying to help her mother plan responsibly for the future. That was the language of someone trying to close a deal before the other party figured out what they were agreeing to. I also knew this. I owned this house free and clear. My husband and I had paid it off 11 years ago. I had a savings account, a modest retirement account, and a small portfolio of bonds that my husband had been very meticulous about maintaining. It wasn't a fortune, but it was something. It was what I had. It was what I intended one day to leave to my daughter. And yes, some to Owen separately, because I believe grandchildren should get something directly and not have to wait for the middle generation to decide to pass it along. I knew something else. I knew my daughter was good with money in the way that people who have never quite had enough of it become good with money. Carefully, constantly, with an edge of anxiety underneath. She and Walter had done fine, but her business had a slow 2 years during the pandemic, and Walter had been laid off once and rehired at lower pay, and I knew, because mothers know, that there was still a weight to things for them that didn't show on the surface. None of that excused what she was doing, not a bit of it, but I needed to understand it because understanding it was the only way I was going to handle it correctly. I did not sleep much that night. I'm not going to pretend I did. I made the tea and I sat and I thought, and somewhere around 2 in the morning I arrived at a conclusion. I needed to talk to someone before I talked to Faye. Not a friend, not my sister out in Phoenix who would have been on the phone with Faye within the hour. I needed to talk to my attorney. His name is Gerald. No, wait, I can't use that name. Let me say, I have an attorney I've worked with for 9 years, ever since we updated the will after my husband's first health scare. A careful man, the kind who reads every line and asks the questions you forgot to think of. I called his office when they opened at 9 the next morning, and his assistant said he had a cancellation on Monday and could fit me in at 11. I said 11 was perfect. Over the weekend I did not call Faye. I did not let on that anything was different. She texted Saturday asking how I was feeling, and I said I was fine and asked how Owen was settling back in after his little adventure, which made her quiet for a moment before she wrote back that he was fine, just being Owen. I sent a heart emoji and I put the phone down and I went to the garden. I thought about my husband. When he was alive, I used to talk things through with him in a way I don't really do with anyone now. Just out loud, in the kitchen, while we were both doing other things. He had a way of listening without stopping what he was doing that made it feel like the thoughts could find their own shape without anyone forcing them. I missed that especially right then. I could have used someone to just listen without forcing. The rose bushes needed deadheading. I did that instead. Monday came. I drove myself to the attorney's office, which is in a low brick building about 12 minutes from my house, and I sat across from him at his desk with its stacks of color-coded folders, and I told him everything. From the first Sunday dinner in March to Owen showing up at my door on Thursday to the phrase, "before she changes her mind." He listened without interrupting, the way good listeners do. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "What would you like to do?" I said I wanted to make sure that whatever happened next, what was mine stayed mine. He said that was very clear, and then he said, "Let me tell you what your options are." We talked for an hour and 15 minutes. I'll spare the full legal detail, but here is the summary. I was under no obligation to sign anything. A durable power of attorney, if I signed one willingly and competently, would give Faye significant authority over my finances and potentially my healthcare decisions, and without the right guardrails, that authority was very broad. The fact that she had been pressing me to sign it quickly, without suggesting that I consult my own attorney first, was, in his words, a flag. He said he wanted to do several things. First, we would update my existing will to reflect my current wishes explicitly, with very specific language about the house and the accounts. Second, we would create a revocable living trust and transfer the house into it. I would be the trustee. My attorney would be the successor trustee. This meant that even if someone tried to claim I was incapable of managing my affairs, the house would be protected inside the trust structure and could not simply be signed over. Third, if I ever did want to execute a power of attorney, we would draft one ourselves, limited, specific, with clear expiration and accountability requirements. I said, what about my grandson? He said, what about my grandson? He said, what about him? I said I wanted him protected specifically. I said I had a feeling about this situation, and I wanted Owen to have something that was his and couldn't be redirected. He said we could set up a separate education trust with Owen as beneficiary, funded with a portion of my savings, held entirely apart from anything Faye could access. I said, do it. He said, it'll take a few days to prepare everything. Can you come back Wednesday? I came back Wednesday. I signed everything. I drove home and I made lunch, and I sat at my kitchen table in the quiet house, and I felt, for the first time in several weeks, that I could breathe properly. Faye called that afternoon. She said she wanted to come by on Friday evening. She said she wanted to finally sit down properly, just the two of us, and go over the paperwork she had drawn up. She said she'd had a paralegal friend help her with it, and it was really very simple, and she thought if I just looked at it, I'd feel more comfortable. She said Walter would come too for support because she knew these conversations could be emotional. She said she'd made a reservation at that Italian place I like on Route 9, dinner first, then paperwork at the house. I said that sounds lovely. I said it very calmly, because I had signed my trust documents that morning, and I had eaten a turkey sandwich for lunch, and the rose bushes were looking very good from the kitchen window, and I was okay. Friday came. Faye and Walter arrived at 6:30 in separate cars. She came from work, he came from wherever he'd been, and we drove to the restaurant together in Walter's SUV. Dinner was genuinely nice. I want to be honest about that. The food was good, and we talked, and Faye was warm, and Walter was funny in his quiet way. And if I hadn't known what I knew, I might have just enjoyed myself. I did enjoy the osso buco. There's no reason to lie about the osso buco. In the car on the way home, Faye said she had the papers in her bag. She said it would only take a minute. At the house, we sat in the living room. She pulled out a manila folder. She set it on the coffee table and opened it and started explaining. Very gently, very patiently. The way she's talked to me since I turned 70, as if patient gentleness were something I now required, that this document would just put her name on the accounts and give her the ability to handle things if anything happened to me. She pointed to the signature line. She already had a pen out. Walter sat on the couch with his hands on his knees and said nothing. I picked up the document. I read it. I read the whole thing slowly, which made Faye's smile become slightly fixed, and then I set it back on the table. I said, Faye, I'm not going to sign this. She said, Mom, I said, let me finish. I said, I met with my attorney on Monday. I said, I've updated my will and I've moved the house into a living trust. I said, I've also set up a separate fund for Owen's education that you and Walter cannot access. I said, everything is protected the way I want it protected with the people I trust. She looked at me. The room was very quiet. Walter looked at the floor. Faye said, I was just trying to help you. I said, I know you believe that. And I said, you're my daughter, and I love you. That hasn't changed. But what you were trying to do here was not help. It was control. And I've been on this earth long enough to know the difference. She started to cry. Not manipulative crying. Real tears, the kind she used to cry when she was small and got caught in something she couldn't talk her way out of. I felt my heart pull toward her the way a mother's heart always will, no matter what. I gave her a moment. I handed her a tissue from the box on the side table. Then I said, I'd like to talk about what's really going on, not the paperwork. Are you in trouble? She didn't answer right away. Walter shifted on the couch. And then very quietly she said that the business had a bad quarter and they had missed 2 mortgage payments and she was scared. And she had told herself, she had genuinely told herself that if she could just get stable access to my assets, she could borrow against them and pay everything back before I ever knew. She had convinced herself it wasn't wrong because it would all go to her anyway, eventually. She said it like a person describing a dream they're embarrassed about. That flat, horrified kind of voice. I said, "And when were you going to tell me you needed help?" She said she didn't want to worry me. I said, "Faye, I'm your mother. Worrying about you is the thing I've done since before you were born. You cannot protect me from that." We talked for a long time after that. Walter, who had been very quiet, eventually said that he was sorry, and I believed him. I think he had gone along with something he knew was wrong, because he was scared, and because Faye is formidable, and he is not, and fear makes people do things they can't quite explain later. I didn't give them access to my accounts. I want to be clear about that. What I did was this. I called my attorney's office the following week and had a conversation about options. There are things you can do, proper things, documented things, when a family member is in genuine financial distress. Structured loans, gifts with clear limits, things that are transparent and voluntary and don't require anyone to sign away. Control of anything, we worked something out. I'm not going to put the numbers in the story, because that's between me and my daughter. But I will say it was enough to get them stable, and it came with conditions, and those conditions have been met. Owen doesn't know most of this. He knows his grandmother was very glad he came over that Thursday evening. He knows I made him shortbread the following Saturday, and we watched a documentary about the history of railroad travel in America that he described, solemnly, as the best 2 hours of his life. He knows I love him. He will know, one day when he's older, that there is a fund in his name that no one can touch. I plan to tell him about it when he's old enough to understand why that matters. Faye and I are still working through it. I won't pretend that one honest conversation fixed everything. Trust is a slower thing than paperwork. But we've been having dinner once a week, and 2 weeks ago she brought flowers without any occasion for it, which made me think we might be getting somewhere. She's also, I notice, stopped talking about my finances entirely, which is either progress or avoidance, and I've decided to assume it's progress until proven otherwise. I think about that Thursday evening a lot. Owen in his jacket with his backpack still on, face flushed from the walk, holding his shortbread and choosing, at 8 years old, to say the hard thing. He hadn't known it was hard. He'd just known something wasn't right, and that I should know about it. That's not something you can teach a child. That's something they either have or they don't, and my grandson has it. I deadheaded the rose bushes again last weekend. The ones my husband planted. They're in full bloom now, pink and a little wild, the way he liked things, though he never would have admitted it. I stood out there in the early morning for a while and just looked at them. The house is mine. The trust is signed. Owen's fund is funded. The paperwork is in a blue folder in the second drawer of my filing cabinet, which has a lock on it, and I have the only key. I made myself a cup of tea and I went inside and I started thinking about what to make for dinner. That's the whole story. That's all of it. I've been thinking about cause and effect a lot lately. Not in any grand philosophical way, just the plain everyday version of it that most people don't notice until they're old enough to look back at the chain of things. Owen walked 4 blocks alone on a Thursday evening because something in him, some instinct that hadn't been trained or coached, told him that I needed to know what he'd heard. That one decision, made by an 8-year-old boy who still had his backpack on and shortbread crumbs on his jacket, changed everything that came after. Not because it was dramatic, because it was true. He just told the truth to the person he trusted, and the whole house of cards his mother had been building quietly for 6 weeks came apart before it could fall on me. That's the thing about honesty in the people we raise. It doesn't announce itself. It shows up at the door on a Thursday looking flushed from the walk. I don't blame Faye for being scared. I've thought about that a lot too, more than she probably knows. Fear makes people reach for control, and when you've watched your savings drain and your mortgage slip, and you still can't talk about it out loud, the mind goes to strange places. She had told herself a story about what she was doing that let her live with it. That's very human. I've told myself easier stories than the true ones at different points in my life. Most people have. The difference is what you do when the story gets tested. What Faye did was press forward. What I did was pay attention. I think that's the part I want to hold on to. Not the legal documents, not the trust, not even the satisfaction of having everything signed and protected before she arrived with her manila folder. It's the paying attention. I had felt something pull in my stomach after that first Sunday dinner in March. I had noticed the vocabulary she was too prepared with, the timing that was too convenient, the way she steered every conversation back to the same point. I noticed, and I did not dismiss what I noticed just because she's my daughter and I love her, and it was easier not to see it. That is something I think we owe ourselves at any age, the willingness to trust what we observe. Not to become suspicious of everyone, not to assume the worst, but to take our own perceptions seriously, especially when something is pulling. Intelligence isn't just about knowing things. It's about being honest with yourself about what you're seeing, even when it's uncomfortable. Sitting at my kitchen table at 2 a.m, making a list, taking myself seriously enough to pick up the phone the next morning, that was its own kind of courage. Not the loud kind, the quiet kind that doesn't make headlines and doesn't need an audience. And then there's this. I could have protected my assets and lost my daughter. I could have handled Friday night as a confrontation, a punishment, an ending. I didn't, because I've been alive long enough to know that people are almost never just one thing. Faye is someone who tried to do something wrong, and also someone who has been my daughter for 51 years. Both things are true. Holding both things at once, that's not weakness. That's the harder kind of strength. Owen will understand all of this someday. I'm in no hurry. Right now he's 8, and he knows his grandmother makes good shortbread and loves trains documentaries, and was very glad he came over that Thursday. That's enough for now. The rest will keep.